Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. All right, we are here with Jennifer Robson from Carleton University, and with all this talk about those McKinsey consultants, I figured we would take a little trip down into what is known as the shadow public service and how this kind of came about and why this is a big deal in government, not only federally, but kind of everywhere. And just me personally, I'm kind of getting a sense that this kind of started in the 80s around, the boom around deregulation, privatization, everyone thinking the public service was really just yes minister, that kind of thing. Maybe I'm wrong, Jennifer.
You're not wrong that this has a much longer history, and that the people who are kind of lighting their hair on fire about it this time around, they've previously singed their hair about this issue, or at least people in similar organizations and positions.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I guess I first became aware of this issue more in the mid 90s when there was the pretty significant effort motivated by deficit reduction
Mhm.
to reduce the size of the federal public service. And what you saw there was some number of public servants who had accumulated, years of expertise, essentially taking early retirement packages or, some other package, but then coming back as consultants. And so there's kind of, I think in the last 20, 30 years, been a kind of a multifaceted evolution of this. And that when people talk about the shadow public service, they sometimes mean different things. So like a lot of eyeballs are on McKinsey right now in terms of winning like professional service contracts where they're coming in and providing analysis and advice and that kind of thing. There's that issue, right, of contracting out to these firms. Again, not new. I came across something that was written by Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives back in 2010, 11, when it was a different stripe of government raising the same sorts of things, right?
Yeah, and I actually linked that one in a column I wrote this week as
Oh,
well.
okay, yeah.
Because this was also a very big issue under the previous government as well, when they were cutting the size of the public service and then having consultants do the work that still needed to be done.
So look, so there's that issue, right? Of the what are you contracting out to the consulting firms?
Yeah.
There's that kind of issue. There's also the whole kind of cottage industry of temporary help agencies in the National Capital Region. And these are basically placement firms that end up putting in people who are working in, yes, sometimes it's administrative functions, but it can also be like media relations and comms advisors and kind of a wide range, right, of positions. And they're placed there through these firms that have standing offers to provide these sorts of services. And then there's kind of the issue of not necessarily the McKinseys of the world, but like maybe just sort of the general issue of contracting out professional public services. And I think all of this, comes back to tension around like make or buy, but yeah, this is a multifaceted issue and this is not new. This has been going on a long time.
And I guess with that in mind, I guess where do we kind of go from here? I mean, this was something that I know the current government had promised to rein in when they formed government in 2015. And lo and behold, some of those contracts have really exploded. What is the kind of difficulty, I guess, in trying to put stuff back in-house, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it is more complicated than that. And let me just also disclose for the benefit of you and your listeners that I am a former public servant myself, spent several years in the public service, including in a position of like being a manager and having to figure out like how to staff some positions and contract out some work.
Right.
So I did that. And yes, I have also provided contract work to the federal public service as a professional services contractor. It's all a matter of public record and la, 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 la. Okay. So just want to be really like transparent.
Absolutely.
About that. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So look, the make or buy decision within the federal public service is a complicated one. On the one hand, the rules of public service hiring are such that it is not easy, right, to offer somebody an indeterminate, permanent, long-term position. But that job security is supposed to be the trade-off and the compensation for providing loyal service to whichever government is duly elected, right, and is formed. That's supposed to be the trade-off, right? But it is not easy to hire people. And as a result, there are often positions in the public service that go unfilled for an extended period of time, and yet the work needs to continue to be done. And that's often where you'll see, for example, the reliance on like temporary help agencies. There's work obviously to be done in terms of, sorry, the public service unions are going to hate me saying this, but there is probably work to be done in terms of thinking about a more flexible, porous public service so that, for example, filling a position is not necessarily a, multi-decade commitment of public expenditure that comes with not just the salary expenses, but of course the long-term pension costs as well.
Yeah.
Yes, I believe in collective bargaining and the right to collective agreements and all that sort of stuff. And I can understand, the unions are really concerned about the shadow public service as an erosion of that.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, when you gatekeep, right, when you make it tough to get into the system, do not be surprised when managers, for reasons of just functionality, have to find other ways to get the stuff done. So there's that issue. I think that there are still areas within the federal public service, right, in terms of being able to purchase access to particular technical expertise that may not be required on an ongoing basis, right? So does it actually make sense, right, to invest in creating not just hiring an individual, but creating an entire sort of team, right, or branch or department or some sort of machinery to conduct a project that you expect to take sort of 2-3 years time? Or is it actually more efficient on a value for money basis to contract those sorts of things? It probably depends on a case by case basis, right?
Yeah. And
arguments for and against. There's I think other concerns about the potential that for a lack of accountability, right? Mm-hmm. There are accountability mechanisms within the public service to hold public servants, to ask them to account. And of course, ministers remain fundamentally at the top of that accountability pyramid.
Yeah.
And I think I understand, there are concerns here about is McKinsey basically able to provide advice or deliver a good or service, but not necessarily have to stick around for the scrutiny and the public accountability and the reporting on how did that go? Was this a good use of taxpayer money? Right. Was the public interest served? Those sorts of things. I would just say to that, though, do not forget that all of the minister who is at the top of that pyramid of accountability remains accountable, right? Parliamentarians can still do their job and ask the minister about what did Canadians get for that spending on McKinsey contracts. I guess there's also sort of this concern, if I understand correctly. I read a column that was titled, "Does McKinsey secretly run Canada?" And I couldn't get much further than the title. I was like, okay, I understand where this is going. So sure, is there a potential for concern that these firms and these outside advisors do not necessarily share the commitment to the public interest that you expect permanent public servants and elected officials to have? They are for, let's not kid ourselves, these are for-profit firms. McKinsey in particular is a multinational for-profit firm with profit motives. And again, I think that this just comes down to a question of making sure that parliamentarians are exercising the accountability functions that they have available to them. They don't necessarily seem to always make full use of those tools, right? And I would say as well, in the last many years, the transparency and disclosure of who's getting what money to do what kinds of services has certainly come a long way. Like the fact that Radio-Canada was able to put together kind of a picture of how much money has McKinsey earned from government contracts tells you, in a sense, like that part of the system is working. There's still this irreducible pressure, though, I think, for if the answer to the make or buy question comes down to buy instead of make, for a government function, that doesn't get public servants or their elected masters out of the problem of they still set the terms of the contract. They still decide on what is an acceptable form of delivery, right? They still set what are they willing to spend on this, right? Like there's, the accountability is still where it ought to be.
I just thinking some of that in terms of like the Phoenix contract, and where some of that kind of played out in terms of what IBM was asked to do, and when people later were saying, well, why can't we sue IBM? The answer was basically IBM did what was asked of them, and the fact that what they were told to do was a problem because of they were trying to fit the requirements to the budget as opposed to the budget to the requirements created that problem. But that was not necessarily the issue of the third party as opposed to all of the ecosystem around it.
And that's a really interesting example, right? Because I think that actually now has become one that is really politically salient. Well, and also frankly, just from a public administration perspective, that like how many other major projects are not getting done because it's very clear the federal public service doesn't have the internal capacity. They are going to have to buy services and goods from the market, right, in order to fulfill and execute the aims. But there's this terror, right, of winding up in another Phoenix scenario where you wear all of the political pain. You didn't get what you thought you needed, but you got what you contracted for. Right. So I wonder to what extent that experience has actually made public servants and political masters a bit gun shy, right, on even some projects that would definitely be in the public interest and that frankly are probably getting to like mission critical at certain stages now.
No, for sure. I guess I'm wondering just also around the transparency and accountability aspect, if we shouldn't have more of a disclosure around what the statement of work was and that kind of thing. Because I mean, sure, it's one thing to have the value of the contracts show up in the public accounts, but should we have some more disclosure in terms of what exactly was being asked, to know that it was something that should have been contracted out instead of possibly doing it in-house? Does that sound like it's a feasible thing, or is that run into other problems as well?
So I would say, look, there's already a bit of that in that you can yourself, like anybody who's watching this could go and look up what are called the tombstones, where you can get a sense, and it's kind of top level information, but you can get a sense of like, what was the category of the kind of good or service that was being purchased? What was the total contract value? What were the contract dates? And sure, all of that, like if you want additional detail, if you want to see a copy of the statement of work, if you want to see the copy of the final deliverable, all of that is atypical. You'll have to wait for it. I guess, look, are there trade-offs? There are trade-offs in the sense that every time that we introduce additional reporting mechanisms in the name of accountability, that is now some public servants' time, energy, and focus on verifying that the statement of work is complete and correct, that it actually matches with what was signed, and that it is uploaded to the proper website in the proper format by the proper deadline, that so-and-so is notified, all that, and then they become essentially accountability process managers as opposed to being the policy analyst that they are supposed to be in that shop. Right. So I guess that's like let's just always bear in mind there is a cost associated in terms of public service performance every time that we introduce additional reporting mechanisms. And
Okay.
maybe that cost is worth spending, right?
Yeah.
Maybe it is. I don't know, but just let's be aware that it's not cost free. That's all.
Okay. That is good to know. All right. Well, thanks so much for giving us all this context. I feel much more informed about the background of this, and we'll do this again soon.
That would be great. Thanks
All
again
right.
for having me.
Thanks.
Take care.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.